समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
Marco Rubio's recent India visit was important for two reasons: to gauge the mood in Washington about US India bilateral ties and to ascertain the future of the Quad. Now, for the first part, the visit reflected a degree of continuity in India US ties. It was an attempt to restore trust in a partnership that, for nearly 25 years, had been built on a convergence of strategic interest and an unusual degree of bipartisan consensus in Washington. Now, even when skepticism over how much to trust the US persisted within sections of India's strategic community, there remained a broad recognition of how deeply embedded the partnership had become. The breakdown of that trust stung when it happened under Trump's second term. But for today's video, however, I am not merely going to repeat that sentiment, but today I'll be talking about four structural issues related to the Quad that now need closer attention. First, though, a quick run through of why the US today remains India's most consequential strategic partner. Now, let's talk a little bit about bilateral momentum. You know, the numbers speak for themselves. America is India's largest export market, a major defense partner, and among the country's biggest investors. In fact, just a few days ago, it overtook Mauritius to become India's second largest source of FDI. The US is also a critical source of remittances, an often understated but vital pillar for an economy where remittance inflows remain higher than FDI. Now, the relationship is also driven by technology, with the US emerging as India's most important technological partner, from semiconductors and AI to critical and emerging technologies. Despite political friction, the strategic architecture, so to say, has continued to deepen. Now, India recently renewed the long term defense cooperation framework with Washington and, albeit later than some others, joined the US led Pax Silica, an initiative to strengthen supply chains for AI era technologies. Simultaneously, the US has become an increasingly important actor in India's energy imports as well, particularly in the context of energy diversification after the Hormuz crisis. Then there is also renewed push on the economic front. Now, as you may know, Commerce Minister Piyush Goyal's visit to the United States has been aimed at progressing negotiations on finalizing the long overdue bilateral trade agreement. Now, the crux of all this is that despite tariff disputes and Trump's unpredictability and undermining of India, the India US relationship continues to move through institutional continuity. But then let's now talk about the Quad, and that is where the plurilateral woes start to appear. It is the Quad that Rubio's visit left a lingering sense of disappointment despite some new add ons. Even as Rubio was in New Delhi, reports began circulating that India may not convene the annual Quad Leaders Summit later this year. In addition, the summit may no longer be convened as a standalone event, the form it had acquired after the Quad was elevated to the leaders level in March 2021 and began drawing considerable global attention as well as objection from Beijing. India, which has held the Quad chair since 2024, was expected to host the long pending summit, but has now cited scheduling constraints. It now appears prepared to pass the baton to Australia. Now, it does not require great strategic imagination or genius to read between the lines. The earlier enthusiasm seems to have faded after Trump's return to office, alongside the collapse of many earlier expectations and the growing caution with which New Delhi now approaches Washington. There are reasons pretty well known in Delhi circles why Prime Minister Modi has carefully avoided an in person meeting with President Trump, either bilaterally or otherwise. The thing is that the Quad is no longer the centerpiece of the US administration's Indo Pacific strategy, and India must revisit and reanalyze four factors in this regard. The first factor is the China question. The assumption was perhaps the most foundational, the belief that India occupies a central and indispensable place in the US Indo Pacific strategy as a counterweight or counterbalance to China. Now, for nearly 2 decades, a broad strategic consensus had taken shape in India that the United States needed India as the demographic, geographic, and security counterweight to China's rise, in fact, domination in the Indo Pacific. The Quad's strategic elevation only reinforced that perception. The grouping appeared to evolve into a nimble, function driven, plurilateral architecture through which Washington, Tokyo, New Delhi, and Canberra could collectively strengthen their respective strategic positions in the Indo Pacific without forcing New Delhi into a formal alliance framework. For India, this arrangement was perfect. India has always remained deeply uncomfortable with openly framing or naming China in adversarial language. Now, unlike the United States, Australia, or increasingly now with Japan, New Delhi has carefully avoided publicly designating China as an enemy or a rival or even a competitor in formal strategic discourse. India's traditional instinct has consistently been to preserve ambiguity and a certain country agnosticism. It wants room for deterrence without direct reference and engagement without alignment. The Quad allowed India to inhabit precisely that space. The Quad's other partners wanted the Indo Pacific to be free and open, but India also wanted it to be inclusive, a semantic directed at assuaging China's allegation that the grouping was an Asian NATO. It gave New Delhi the ability to enhance its strategic profile in the Indo Pacific, deepen maritime cooperation, expand technological coordination, and participate in balancing China while simultaneously retaining the diplomatic flexibility to insist that Quad was not aimed at any one country. That said, everyone in the business understood what Quad really aimed for. The repeated diplomatic assertions that the Quad was not directed against China enabled India to participate in a containment like architecture without openly endorsing containment. That balancing act fit perfectly well within India's larger worldview of strategic autonomy, a foreign policy culture that avoids treaty entanglements and resists reducing India into a subordinate pillar within another power's geopolitical designs. Now, India, for its part, balanced that with other groupings such as BRICS and the SCO, even with zilch, which means zero strategic alignment in the latter two on economic or security matters. But that underlying assumption that India remains central to Washington's Indo Pacific calculus now appears far less certain under Trump 2.0. The second factor here is to do with America's Indo Pacific drift itself. The signs are already visible in the declining political energy around the Quad itself. The Trump administration's lukewarm approach toward the grouping, coupled with its broader tendency to undercut allies and partners through transactional bargaining, is pretty evident. The earlier belief that the Quad represented a carefully nurtured American strategic investment in India now looks shakier. And that is because the United States Indo Pacific strategy itself has changed considerably since it was first articulated in late 2017, almost 11 years ago, under the banner of a free and open Indo Pacific. That was the title. Now, that phrase survives, but not the clarity. In 2026 and 11 years later, the US under Trump remains intensely engaged across multiple theaters, whether it's homeland security, Latin America, Venezuela, Cuba, the war engulfed Middle East, even Africa. Despite loud rhetoric about reducing commitments to Europe and NATO, structural constraints imposed through congressional mechanisms such as the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, have prevented any meaningful strategic withdrawal from Europe. Now, Washington also doubled down on Greenland, creating global confusion before eventually settling into negotiations and strategic deals. Simultaneously, the United States has emerged as one of the main hydrocarbon suppliers in the post-Hormuz global energy order, making substantive long-term investments in energy infrastructures across Central and Balkan Europe. Now, in other words, what I wish to underscore is that American strategic activism has not diminished globally. It has merely shifted elsewhere and at the cost of Indo-Pacific. The pause on US arms sales to Taiwan after Trump's summit with Xi has amplified that perception further. Today, nobody is entirely certain what the United States would actually do in the event of a contingency in the Taiwan Straits. The rhetoric of deterrence remains, but the strategic signaling underneath appears inconsistent. Across the region, the dominant impression is not one of energetic commitment, but of apathy and pressure on partners to do more. Now let's come to the third factor: Quad versus the squad. And this is where another factor becomes important. Even as the Quad appears to have lost some salience in Washington's strategic imagination, that cannot be said of its far more operational and militarized cousin, the so-called Squad, a grouping comprising the United States, Japan, Australia, and the Philippines. The growing security coordination between these countries has accelerated from mid-2023 onwards. Unlike the Quad, which was deliberately designed as a broad diplomatic and strategic framework, the Squad emerged as a tactical frontline security arrangement centered around the South China Sea. The distinction matters enormously because India, although deeply invested in the Quad, has always preferred bilateral engagement with the Philippines rather than participation in overtly militarized plurilateral frameworks directed against China. The sale of BrahMos missiles to Manila represented a major development in itself, but New Delhi has remained cautious about integrating that relationship into a tighter operational grouping. The Squad, however, is built differently. It is designed for real-time tactical coordination in highly contested waters where Chinese coercion is already active and immediate. With the Philippines directly confronting aggressive Chinese maneuvers inside its exclusive economic zone or EEZ, the grouping focuses on joint Coast Guard patrols, maritime deterrence, direct military equipment transfers, and coordinated responses to South China Sea incidents. And unlike the Quad, three members of the Squad, the US, Japan, and Australia, are formal treaty-bound allies of the Philippines. That changes the nature of deterrence entirely. Their security architecture is explicitly designed around the possibility of direct intervention should Philippines forces come under attack. The Trump administration itself has assured Manila of its ironclad commitment to 1951 defense treaty while also approving large-scale arms sales recently. Now, compared to all this, the Quad increasingly appears broader, softer, and less operationally cohesive to tackle China. Ironically, even after Operation Sindoor and repeated statements by the Indian defense establishment regarding China's role in aiding Pakistan, New Delhi appears to have opted not for greater hawkishness but for a cautious rapprochement. One might have expected India to harden its China posture further. Instead, what has emerged is a renewed caution. And that brings me to the fourth factor, which is a hard lesson for India. The most sobering and oft repeated realization that is shaping Indian foreign policy now is that no external power is ultimately going to underwrite India's interests directly or indirectly. The only durable solution, however difficult, lies in converting India's long advertised strategic potential into actual strategic leverage, the real and rude awakening of Trump 2.0. And in my opinion, a lot of this recalibration is already visible. Now, fears of a full-fledged US-China G2 remain exaggerated because the structural rivalry between Washington and Beijing remains very real and hasn't gone anywhere. Nevertheless, India has been forced to rethink its own position within a bipolar world with unipolar characteristics due to Trump's actions. Therefore, One of the important takeaways of the Trump 2.0 era has been India's renewed search for more stable and predictable partnerships, particularly with Europe, Japan, South Korea, and Canada, while preserving old ones like Russia and simultaneously developing strategic initiatives such as the Great Nicobar Project. But there is one caveat. It does not mean that India is returning to the commonly professed equidistance from all great powers. In fact, much of the confusion surrounding Indian foreign policy stems from India's own long standing reluctance to clearly define its strategic outlook in explicit terms. Now, Indian strategic culture often thrives on interpretations rather than clarity. Now, whether that ambiguity is an asset or a liability remains deeply debated within the strategic community itself. What can no longer be denied, however, is that the current international disorder is increasingly forcing India to confront its own neglected structural weaknesses. And I'll be back to discuss that and more. Stay tuned.